home invasion.
This is like the stuff of nightmares.
Y'all better get out of my house.
It begins as a normal Wednesday night with 3 kids hanging out at a friend's house.
This is happening at 8:40 at night. It's not too late, but the parents are out for the evening. The teenagers are home alone.
But then there's a startling noise. One of the teens steps outside to see what it is, only to get a horrible shock.
2 masked intruders break in.
The intruders, armed with long guns, burst into the house and take the terrified teens hostage.
They're threatening to kill these teenagers. Your brain doesn't know how to make sense of this. You're thinking, I need to do whatever it takes to survive the situation.
I think the teenagers actually behaved exactly how they should have. They completely followed orders. At one point, the friend even scooted closer to his friend, probably just to comfort her because he knew how scared she was.
They start to ransack this home, and they start to attack these teenagers. They start pulling the teenagers' hair.
The hooded criminals force one of the teens to her feet.
She's thinking, oh my God. She's wondering if she's gonna survive this attack. She's thinking, are they gonna attack me? Am I gonna feel a lot of pain? Is anyone going to help me?
You always are told, never go somewhere with a suspect, with a criminal, because once you leave that area, the likelihood that something bad will happen increases. If she's abducted, if she's kidnapped, are they trying to hold her for ransom? What could be their purpose for taking her to another room, to another location?
Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a booming voice interrupts the mayhem.
I got you on camera. The cops are on their way.
So they have video cameras in the home. The parents see what's happening.
The terrified dad gets an alert on his phone, but he's at a restaurant and can't get there quickly, so all he can do is yell.
Y'all better get out of my house.
As a parent, you feel helpless, and you're thinking that any minute now, I could watch my child being shot, being killed by these intruders.
My neighbors are there. They're calling the cops right now.
He's trying any tactic he can to get them out of that house and keep his kids alive.
It seems to work, because suddenly the intruders flee.
When people who commit crimes know that someone's watching, it changes their behavior.
So clearly Dad's quick thinking did save their lives and did save the day.
The teens are okay, but very shaken.
It's a traumatizing event because you have no control over what's going to happen, and your heart is racing. You're breathing fast. You're thinking that you don't know if someone's gonna help you, if someone's gonna rescue you. You're thinking that this is your last night alive.
With the suspects at large, the fearful family posts their home surveillance footage to social media, and it quickly goes viral.
The parents watch in horror on their Ring Camera cell phone app.
Police develop leads, but they go cold. Fear spreads through the community. Where are these assailants? As police hunt for the masked assailants who took a group of teens captive in their own home, they do their best to calm nervous neighbors.
The neighborhood probably doesn't sleep as well at night knowing that this happened.
The intruders have yet to be identified, and no arrests have been made.
If I know that those criminals are still out there in the community, I'm definitely sleeping with all the locks on the door, and I'm getting as many cameras on my property as possible.
Those security cameras can be vital, especially with criminals like these who use a terrifying tactic.
What's especially frightening is what one of the suspects was wearing.
We're looking at surveillance footage that's coming from outside someone's apartment. Suddenly we see people with guns kicking down the door.
they have assault rifles with large mag capacity. When they enter the home, you could hear them shout HPD, Houston Police Department. Law enforcement would enter a home like this if they have a valid search warrant.
But they are definitely not police officers.
If that was happening to my apartment, I would immediately be like, what did I do wrong?
It is very hard to defend yourself in a situation like this because people are very trusting.
Inside, another security camera catches the invaders prowling through the residence. But now, the homeowner is awake.
I can only imagine the adrenaline that was going through the homeowner's body at this time. He's sound asleep, he hears a door crashing, and he grabs his weapon.
Within seconds, this homeowner has gun in hand, ready to fight off intruders.
And he's now confronted with the life and death situation.
After a few tense moments, everything erupts.
Now for a split second, we have total chaos in the house. Bullets are flying everywhere, and we have active gunfire.
Bullets even rip through the walls of a neighboring apartment.
Thankfully, right when the homeowner started firing, the not HPD starts running off away, proving that it's not real officers.
Fortunately, no one is hurt, but the crooks get away. And the homeowner says he never believed that they were police. He suspected they were there to rob him. Police releases footage and the story goes viral.
Crime Stoppers now offering a $5,000 reward for anyone that has any information that can lead to an arrest.
The case remains unsolved, and what's troubling is that criminals posing as trusted city employees has become common. Here, a person dressed as a utility worker approaches the home of an elderly woman.
Although he's dressed normally like an electrical worker would be, one thing threw it off. He's wearing a ski mask.
Luckily, the woman inside notices something is off about this guy, so she does not open the door for him. Unfortunately, though, while she was distracted by this guy at the front door, two men broke in through the back door.
This is a common tactic. They distract the victim to the front door while their counterpartners are entering the residence by some other means.
And they not only burglarized her house, but they beat her as well.
After a few terrifying minutes, the fake utility workers flee. But now, someone sees them.
And just as these burglars are getting away from this woman's house with all of her stuff, one of her relatives is driving up.
After beating an elderly woman and stealing everything she has, criminals posing as fake utility workers make a run for it, just as one of her family members arrives at her house.
And I can only imagine what is going through their head.
The woman is okay, but when her sad story hits the news, it strikes a nerve.
Choked and robbed of her entire life savings. That's what happened to a 70-year-old Daly City woman this week. But what's especially frightening is what one of the suspects was wearing.
The fact that this happened in broad daylight further shows that dressing up in these uniforms are kind of camouflage because you're just assuming that's someone going about their workday.
One of the robbers, Daroon Cheeves, is arrested a month later. He pleads not guilty to multiple counts of first-degree burglary, residential robbery, and grand theft. He and his partners are suspected of committing multiple robberies, but his cohorts are still at large. The victim's family raises more than $60,000 to help her out, but no amount of money can restore her sense of security. And experts warn that we should all be alert to criminals in fake uniforms.
When you're in a position of authority or power, people are less likely to ask you questions.
If someone rings your doorbell, do not unlock it for any reason until you are absolutely sure that they are there for the right reason.
And being somewhere for the wrong reason can definitely land you in hot water.
Oh, does this guy have some problems?
You can't go anywhere, nobody can help you, and what are you gonna do?
This is where the owner says a burglar broke in through the roof.
Thought this was really something that I've only seen in movies.
It begins at 4 a.m. at a cell phone store in Southern California.
So the burglar here kind of enters in a way I didn't really know happened in real life. Came in through the air duct.
Armed with a bag to collect his loot, the burglar suddenly looks confused.
The minute he gets in there, he realizes, oh, the store doesn't even have any cell phones.
The store, it's empty because it's not done yet, which I don't think this burglar researched before entering it.
So he probably thinks either I need to get out of here or I need to go look and see if it's hidden somewhere in the back. I think that's what led him to the hallway.
So in this hallway that he's finding himself in, there is clearly the door that he entered the hallway with that is now closed. There's a door that looks almost like every single exit that we see in buildings that is not opened, but there is a mystery third door. It could just be an additional exit. We don't know, and the robber doesn't know either.
You would think that a career burglar could just as easily break out of a place as he did breaking in.
So you see the burglar trying to understand where he is, but it's pitch black there. So his lighter is up, like he's at a concert, looking for anything.
Anytime you hear an alarm, you're gonna think, okay, who can hear that? Who's been alerted? Are police on the way? Okay, I need to act fast. He realizes he's in this dead-end hallway and he's trapped. I have to imagine when he gets into this hallway and realizes there's no way out, there's this immediate fear, this immediate claustrophobia.
The desperate would-be thief tries everything he can think of.
I feel at first he's kind of just in the fight or flight, and he's really trying to flight right now.
He uses donkey kicks, he uses front kicks.
Like, there has to be a way for me to get out of here.
But nothing works.
He has tools with him because, again, he broke into the store. He pulls out a hammer and he starts trying to break the window of that door. The hammerhead breaks off. So now he has to think, oh my God, I don't even have any tools anymore. I just broke the only thing that could possibly get me out.
In this moment, I feel anything that is going through this burglar's mind would have to be bleeped out. I'm just imagining him saying every curse word imaginable.
But what the hapless robber doesn't know is that this hallway is designed to be a trap. After losing thousands of dollars in 20 prior burglaries, the owner of this store constructed a dead-end hallway fortified with reinforced steel.
He's like, maybe I can try this and punch through this steel door, or maybe I can try this and donkey kick my way through this other door, or maybe I can try to climb up to a ceiling. He does eventually get into that other door, but he realizes it's just a closet and it leads to nowhere.
So now what? Is this trapped would-be thief out of options? The man who tried to rob a cell phone store only to discover that there's nothing to steal. And what's more, the owner has designed a trap, realizes that he's doomed.
After trying to kick down the other door for a while, he's completely given up. He decides to start drinking out of the spigot in the wall.
He hydrates a little bit, which is important, I guess, if you're trying to break out of where you broke into.
Rule of thumb, always carry a bottle of water on you wherever you go.
After 45 long minutes, the police finally arrive.
He absolutely has to be relieved that the police showed up. Even though he knows he's gonna be arrested, he knows he's at least not trapped in a hallway and gonna die of starvation or dehydration.
The man is arrested, and the story about the trapped robber quickly goes viral.
Usually, burglars break into a business, but not in this case.
His escape plan was foiled, and he ended up getting caught on security cameras and getting trapped inside for nearly an hour.
That door shuts and you're done. You're not getting out of there.
Watching the panic set in and seeing him just feel like this trapped rat in a cage, it's almost comical. It's almost like he thinks he could be like the Kool-Aid man. He almost knocks himself out trying to get through these doors.
I think this robber might be one of the first robbers to shout hallelujah when the police came to arrest him, because otherwise I think he would have just been stuck in there overnight or for weeks.
Another robber gets what he came for, but then is trapped by someone who is determined not to let him get away.
The chase is on. A Good Samaritan is in pursuit of a suspect.
It's a viral video that grabs international attention.
When an old lady's purse was snatched, this guy didn't hesitate.
Hero takes action after a thief snatches a woman's purse.
With an 87-year-old woman at the heart of this story, it gets millions of views.
He stole my purse!
It all starts just after 11 a.m. outside a grocery store. Inside, two strangers, Pat Goins and Deshaun Presley, exchange friendly banter. But as soon as they part ways, a man snatches Pat's purse.
I heard screaming,
"He stole my purse!"
It was the yell that I need help. I just turned around and did what I had to do. He was running and looking back, and I was like, yeah, I'm on you.
There are about a dozen more citizens in the parking lot.
You see them kind of inching closer.
And soon, a crowd surrounds him. Some seem hesitant to get involved.
If you can look, there's one woman on the right, like right near her car, kind of just watching, being like, what is going on? I feel in her mind she's having the internal debate of, should I call someone or should I get popcorn to watch how this plays out?
The worst case scenario could be that everyone jumped in and began to pound this guy in the pavement. There is a second citizen also engaged with this incident. He grabs the purse, holds it up in the air, saying that he has the purse, letting everybody know that he has the purse back.
The guy who just grabs the stolen purse off the ground and is holding it like, oh, I did it, I saved the day, as this beatdown is still going on from the guy who actually apprehended the thief. Meanwhile, the real hero of the story has captured the purse snatcher.
Police arrive within 7 minutes and immediately arrest 58-year-old Derek Vaughn. He's sentenced to 5 years probation and ordered to undergo drug and alcohol monitoring. Pat's story makes big news.
He stole my purse out of the cart. I had a few choice words to say. I feel angry. I feel that he picked me because I was a senior citizen. He could outrun me.
And Deshaun is widely praised for his bravery.
Deshaun, I'm so glad to know that there are people like you in this world still.
I had to do what I had to do. I was on his
The sheriff of Butler County honors Deshaun with a special award.
We're proud of you, and I mean that. And thank you for what you've done. All right.
What's very sweet and touching about this story is Deshaun let everybody know that this situation really meant a lot to him because he was raised by his own grandmother.
My mom died when I was young, and my grandma took me in, and she did very good by me. And, you know, she had, you know, house rules and stuff like that that I had to abide by, and I didn't like it, but I had to do what I had to do. She taught me, and I'm thankful.
And Pat and Deshaun have now gone from viral crime to friends for life.
Tell them, Miss P, this is not the only day we're gonna see each other.
That's right.
We're gonna remain in contact with each other.
Yeah, and we've got a dinner date.
And we got a dinner.
All
right. Yeah.
The
victim drove through the ATM.
They catch you by surprise.
Surveillance video shows one woman robbed in her own driveway.
Be aware of your surroundings, especially when leaving banks.
They're very aggressive.
It's a violent crime that's on the rise.
Jugging, remember when somebody watches you withdraw from a bank and then follows you to try to rob you of your cash.
And these bold thieves don't wait until dark to make their move.
Caught on camera tonight, a jugging crime in broad daylight right in the middle of a neighborhood.
A Houston mother is out running errands in her car, making stops at the grocery store and the bank.
This victim has no idea that someone is following her. She's just unloading groceries from her car, going about her day as casually as anybody else would be.
On the right side of your screen, you can hear our victim screaming for help. Then she's mugged.
She falls to the ground and shrieks, and he makes off with her purse.
The woman calls police and is briefly hospitalized for minor injuries. But the horror of being attacked right outside your own home hits a nerve.
When we talk about jugging attacks, it's often victims that walk out of the bank carrying an obvious money bag or that white envelope filled with cash. But in this case, the victim drove through the ATM and still she was targeted.
The victim doesn't speak publicly, but her son does.
It's really disappointing, really scary. I just feel like we need to bring justice to this individual, especially just for all the pain and suffering, which I'm noticing is the biggest thing that she's going through.
The case remains unsolved, but it is far from the last incident.
What is common among these juggings that they happen in broad daylight, but they happen very quickly.
At this store in Austin, it happens so fast, it takes everyone, customers included, by surprise. Look at this bystander in the red shorts. Without even realizing it, he steps right between the thieves and their target. Meanwhile, the man running into the store desperately tries to shake the two men who are after him.
So this guy is realizing that he is being followed after leaving a bank and is thinking to himself, where's the safest place I can go right now?
Even though this man is alert, these thieves are determined.
The second he goes into this store, the people who are following him follow him into this store as well and immediately start this really intense beatdown. The clerk, being a good Samaritan, is trying to help stop this, jumping to the defense, only then he also is getting a beatdown himself.
This has turned into mayhem. And now, both the man these crooks followed into the store and the clerk who is trying to help him are fighting for their lives. It's a vicious fight. But after a few minutes, these thieves get their cash and dash out the door.
There was a witness. We do not believe this witness is directly involved. Based off of the surveillance footage, it appears this witness kind of caught on to what was going on, and as the suspects were leaving, they tossed some cash at him. He took it and left. We are interested in speaking with this person as a witness, not a suspect.
He's not coming forward, and I wonder why.
The story hits the news, and the brave clerk speaks out.
He says he witnessed the beating right in front of himself, and he actually became the victim himself.
The other guy, he hit me here too. And I fall. After that, just scared.
For now, the case remains unsolved. Disturbingly, it was just one of more than 125 jugging crimes in Austin in 2022.
These videos make me feel very concerned about how I go about my own day.
To protect yourself, experts say you must be vigilant.
Always pay attention who's in the lobby when you are inside of a bank. Notice people that are sitting in their cars in the parking lot.
And the key thing to remember about jugging is that it can happen anytime someone thinks you're carrying cash.
They're eyeing you from the start. Danger really could be jumping out of anywhere when you're not even expecting it.
That's exactly what happens to an innocent young girl in New York.
2 men on a motorbike are wanted in a violent robbery spree that targets women.
In Queens, police are searching for 2 thieves who are snatching necklaces.
They are brazen attacks that spare no one.
It happened fast.
She's still scared to walk on the street now.
It begins with a routine stroll along a New York sidewalk.
This is a young girl who is coming home from school. She's minding her own business. If you look closely, you can see a very long gold chain this 12-year-old girl is wearing.
When you're showing flashy jewelry, you may attract unwanted attention. I know we all like wearing nice things, but understand that there might be some nefarious characters, and they're looking for people like you who are not prepared for the situation so that they can take advantage of it as soon as you're not paying attention.
And this girl's chain, a gift from her mom, is worth $1,800. What happens next is hard to watch. A moped pulls onto the sidewalk, which seems like nothing at first. But the 2 people on this bike are laser focused.
Muggers roll up on this 12-year-old girl and snatch her chain.
In a blink of an eye, really in an instant, she is ripped to the ground, and something that means a lot to her is taken from her.
The brave girl fights to keep her necklace, even as she's yanked violently.
This little girl is whipped around.
In the midst of the mayhem, the men crash the moped.
Somehow, both suspects are able to get back on and drive away. This 12-year-old is left right there on the sidewalk. This is a violent incident.
A bystander dials 911, and as soon as police get involved, they release video of the frightening incident, which is caught on a building surveillance camera.
What happened to this 12-year-old girl walking home from school in her neighborhood is just terrible.
The NYPD says they want you to take a good look at the video.
Police are asking for the public's help in identifying those 2 suspects on that red scooter.
The 12-year-old girl, who is scratched but otherwise uninjured, describes the horrifying ordeal to the media.
They're just the worst human beings alive. It happened fast, so I didn't feel when I was getting dragged. I only cared about the necklace. So I didn't know what to do or how to react. I've never harmed someone in a way the way they did to me, so it's I don't think I deserve that.
And as it turns out, these same men are behind a series of similar muggings.
In Queens, police are searching for 2 thieves who are snatching necklaces off of victims' necks. Police now know about 7 different robberies.
The victims are mostly women between the ages of 12 and 70 years old.
They are violent attacks, and 4 of the incidents take place in a single day.
The victims are approached from behind. When you don't really see something coming, it's a little bit more difficult to protect yourself.
In general, if you're wearing nice jewelry, you have to make sure that you're aware of your surroundings. And if possible, if you're out in a public area, tuck the jewelry in. It's not important to show it off at all times.
Crimes can happen anywhere, unfortunately. They can happen on a busy street, they can happen in your home, they can happen at your work.
And the most difficult part for this young girl and her mom is that the suspects have yet to be identified and are still at large.
This is still an unsolved crime. These guys are still out there. This situation happens a lot. You have these habitual offenders, they're organizations in their own right. They're doing it as many times as they can until they're caught. And that's why it's so important to get these guys off the street when we can, because unless we stop them, they'll keep going.
Being attacked when you are simply going about your daily routine is always jarring. Here, a daily commute
Terrifying situation caught on video
turns into a wild shootout.
This is brazen.
In the middle of the highway, this is absolutely unbelievable.
we're looking at right now, this is dash cam video. It's on the south side of Chicago in the middle of the day.
Huber Perez Negron is out running errands with a friend.
Traffic is stopped on the roadway. There's a vehicle in front of this car.
Suddenly, the back door swings open and someone gets out.
It appears that he has a long gun.
Then, another man comes out the other side. And with no warning, they begin firing into traffic.
The other one has a handgun of sorts, and they're running down the middle of the lanes. In all of this traffic, with all of these people,
The assault rifle has a drum magazine. So we're talking about a lot of ammunition is going to be fired. So this person came for a war.
It's wild rapid fire, with no apparent regard for anyone's life.
Holy is that a shootout?
It appears they are targeting their shots at a car that's trapped in traffic ahead of them.
there are people all around. Someone could have been seriously hurt.
We always worry about an innocent person sitting in a car or just an innocent person walking by. Collateral damage hits home every day.
In the midst of it all, Huber is helpless. All he can do is watch as his dash cam records.
If this were me, I would probably be on the floor of the car. But he watches this unfold. He starts to slouch down a little bit. He doesn't take off his seatbelt. He's not in a panic and keeps kind of popping back up and looking to see what's happening and then going back down again.
If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, stay calm and find cover.
With heavy traffic behind them, they're stuck. Just when it looks like this will have a nightmarish end, the shooter's gun malfunctions.
If you look here in the top left corner, the magazine falls out of the gun, and that is good for everyone because now the suspect does not have the capacity to fire multiple rounds.
But is this over yet? After firing wildly into traffic, the two shooters responsible for all the terror jump back into their car and speed off. For Huber Perez Negron, who has been stuck right in the midst of it, there is immense relief.
He takes a long drag of his cigarette and sort of just exhales. And it may be just an exhale of like, my goodness, I am so glad this is over. And he's able to drive away.
Miraculously, no one is injured. Multiple calls come into 911 after the gunfire is picked up on something called a shot spotter.
Shot spotters are essentially microphones in neighborhoods that picks up the sounds of gunfire, in which they can have officers dispatched to that area.
Huber's footage of the shocking shootout goes viral.
Terrifying situation caught on video. A man stuck in traffic, but all of a sudden he's right in the middle of a shootout.
See, I hear a lot of the stuff on the news, like say stabbings and robberies, and I really never thought that I'd experienced what I did yesterday. It just shocked me. Well, it surprised me at first. I really thought, man, these other guys are gonna shoot back, and I'm directly right behind them.
Despite having the video, police are unable to identify the shooters, and no arrests have been made.
If the suspects are caught, they could face multiple charges: shooting into occupied dwelling, going armed to terror the public, assault with a deadly weapon, intent to kill, and many, many more.
But it's a commute no one who witnessed will ever forget.
This is 100% out of the ordinary. This is brazen. This is in the middle of the day. There are people all around. Someone could have been seriously hurt, and thank goodness they weren't.
Another out-of-the-ordinary crime caught on camera ends with employees turning the tables on the surprise thief.
He's like a caged animal at this point.
Let me out, man. You think I'm playing?
We're looking at security camera footage from a convenience store in Washington, D.C. And there's this reoccurring character that seems to come into the store a lot.
This is a guy employees at that store have dubbed Gatorade Man because he is known to come inside of the store and take things. A lot of times it's Gatorade.
Gatorade Man has been stealing from this store for about a year. He always dresses differently, but he's caught on camera every time.
He's pretty brazen. He's not your typical thief. He walks in head held high, picks up whatever he wants, and walks right out, knocking the door open dramatically. But on this day, things don't go as planned.
You can see on camera, he is filling up his bag full of drinks, full of snacks.
When the clerk sees him, he recognizes him.
The clerk presses a button, the door locks, that's it. You're stuck inside. When he goes to exit, the door is locked. He can't get out.
He starts to panic. And when people like this start to panic, their body goes into fight or flight. They get tense, they get restless, and they can get really aggressive and desperate. The clerk is probably afraid too. He's thinking, is this man gonna start attacking me?
But the door doesn't budge. So the agitated thief switches tactics.
At this point, Gatorade Man realizes that he's trapped. He frantically puts the things back on the shelf.
Let me know. Let me know, man.
But the clerk still refuses to open the door. He's on the phone pleading with 911 to send help. So Gatorade Man goes back to it.
They gon' play.
The door is being kicked repeatedly over and over and over and over again. And eventually, that glass in the front of the door gives way.
After 5 minutes, the determined thief finally makes his escape.
I can't even imagine how the shop owner may feel. You know, these small business owners, they work hard for what they have. And, you know, he has to pay out of pocket to stock his shelves. And so when you have someone who's coming in, allegedly taking things, it's got to be very frustrating and it's got to be very expensive for him.
The frustrated store owner shares the video with the local news.
The guy who put that lock in swore to me that lock will not break. And it didn't. The door broke before the lock did.
But incredibly, a few weeks later, this guy comes back.
Petty theft occurs for a lot of reasons. Some people steal because they really need to eat. And some steal compulsively. They steal foolish things like Gatorade.
Let me know.
And it's like deja vu. Once again, he can't get out.
It's like a caged animal at this point. He knows that he is trapped.
Except this time, things move quickly. The store owner, Dennis Alloy, is exasperated. But then a local man tells him he knows the thief and offers to set up a meeting in the parking lot.
Leading up to this meeting, he's probably thinking, what am I gonna say to this guy? Am I gonna be so angry that I start yelling at him?
And surprisingly, Gatorade Man apologizes.
Man, I apologize. I sincerely apologize. I apologize to Dennis. If y'all remember me, I came here and took stuff, and I apologize.
He explains to Dennis that he's had a struggle with addiction. When people are on substances, especially when they're withdrawing, they're not thinking about the repercussions. They're doing what they need to feel better.
This owner has a very big heart, and he decides that the things in his store aren't as important as this other person's life and what he's going through at this time.
Dennis realizes that, okay, there's room for redemption here.
So, in a heartwarming twist, he skips calling the police and instead gives Gatorade Man some work, cleaning, scrubbing, and restocking.
Gatorade Man ends up working for the owner for a day and apparently does a really, really good job.
Addiction does not have to define you. Your brain can function properly. You can have purpose in life.
Since this forged relationship happened, it's more of a happier ending to this story.
The night Ohio forgot how to sleep began with a single flickering porch light, buzzing like a trapped insect in the damp air of early autumn. The The kind of night where sound travels too far and shadows refuse to stay still. The kind of night people remember years later and say they felt something was wrong before they ever knew why. Because at 11:47 p.m., on a quiet residential street where nothing ever made headlines, a car door slammed once. Hard, sharp, final, and then there was nothing, no scream. No engine roaring away, just silence pressing down on the houses like a held breath that never quite released. By morning, the silence had turned radioactive. Police tape cut through the street like a fresh wound. Red and blue lights bounced off white siding and closed blinds. Neighbors stood barefoot on their lawns, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the same spot, the same patch of cracked asphalt where a young woman's purse lay overturned, its contents scattered as if dropped mid-motion, lipstick rolling to a stop in the gutter, keys missing, wallet still there. Cash untouched, the kind of detail investigators would circle again and again in the years to come, because it made no sense. And in cases like this, what makes no sense is often the loudest clue. Her name was whispered before it was confirmed. 24 years old. Lived 3 blocks away. Worked late shifts. Known for never missing a call home. Last seen walking from her car toward the house. Less than 40 yards from her front door. A distance so short it barely counts. A distance people cross every night without thinking. A distance that would become infamous. Measured and remeasured by detectives with flashlights and notepads. By journalists hunting angles, by armchair sleuths decades later scrolling through scanned police reports, all asking the same question Ohio asked that morning. How does someone vanish in plain sight? The official term came quickly. Missing person. Potential abduction. No witnesses. No usable fingerprints. No signs of a struggle violent enough to leave blood. Just absence. And absence, as every investigator knows, is the hardest thing to prove. The community reacted the way communities always do at first. Shock, then unity. Search parties formed before the sun was fully up. Volunteers combed fields, drainage ditches, wooded lots behind abandoned factories, their boots sinking into mud that smelled like rust and rot. Helicopters thudded overhead. Dogs tracked scents that went nowhere, stopped abruptly, circled, then sat, confused, as if the trail itself had been erased. Flyers appeared on telephone poles, gas station windows, school bulletin boards, her face reproduced in grainy black and white, smiling, unaware she was about to become a question mark. Police held press conferences with careful words and tighter expressions. They said they were following several leads. They said there was no danger to the public. They said anyone with information should come forward immediately. What they didn't say, what hung unspoken between every sentence, was that nothing like this had happened here before. Not like this. Not so clean. Not so fast. Within days, rumors filled the gaps where facts should have been. A strange scene circling the block. A man arguing with her weeks earlier. A coworker who seemed too nervous. An ex who hadn't been cleared. Tips flooded the department, each one demanding time, manpower, hope. Detectives worked 18-hour days, their desks buried under maps, timelines, photographs, each item pinned and repinned as theories rose and collapsed. They retraced her last known movements minute by minute, second by second, trying to stretch that short walk into something longer, something that could explain the impossible. Then the trail went cold. Weeks turned into months. Months hardened into years. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved away or forgot details they once swore were unforgettable. The flyers faded, peeled, vanished. Her name stopped leading the evening news and slipped into the quieter category, reserved for unresolved cases. The ones reporters mention only when there's nothing else to fill the slot. Inside the department, her file thickened but never closed, labeled and relabeled as a cold case, a phrase that sounds clinical but feels like surrender. The town changed in subtle ways. Porch lights stayed on longer. Parents walked their children to the bus stop. Late-night shifts were swapped or avoided. Every unfamiliar car became suspicious. Every unexplained noise triggered a glance over the shoulder. The knowledge settled in slowly and then stayed. If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Investigators revisited the case again and again, each time hoping distance had sharpened perspective instead of dulling it. New detectives brought fresh eyes, questioned old assumptions, tested evidence that technology had finally caught up with, but the answers remained stubbornly out of reach. The purse, the missing keys, the untouched cash, the silent street. Each element fit nowhere and everywhere at once. Years passed. A decade. More. The case became a fixture in training seminars, an example of how quickly control can slip away, how a moment's gap can swallow a life whole. Retired officers admitted it still haunted them. Younger ones studied it with a mix of fascination and dread, aware they were inheriting not just a file, but a failure. And then, without warning, the past came back loud. A name surfaced, not a new one, but one buried deep, overlooked, dismissed early when evidence didn't line up cleanly enough. A routine arrest on an unrelated charge. A DNA sample taken as protocol. A database update no one expected to matter. A match that made seasoned investigators stare at the screen in silence. The kind of silence that comes before a room explodes. The call went out quietly at first. Supervisors summoned. Files reopened. Old notes dragged into the light. The timeline redrawn with shaking hands. When the arrest finally happened, it was swift, almost anticlimactic. A man led out of a building he'd walked into freely, unaware that a shadow from 1992 had finally found him. News broke within hours. Ohio woke up to headlines it never thought it would read again. Cold case breaks wide open. Surprise arrest shocks town. But shock is not the same as closure. As cameras rolled and reporters crowded the courthouse steps, one truth remained untouched, heavy, unresolved. An arrest answers a question, but it doesn't answer them all. Somewhere between that slammed car door and this sudden turn, something still didn't fit. Something still refused to speak. And as the town held its breath once more, the old fear crept back in, quieter now, but no less sharp, whispering that some stories don't end just because we want them to. And the cold case, long frozen in time, began to thaw in ways no one was prepared for. The arrest did not bring relief the way everyone expected, because relief requires certainty, and certainty was the one thing this case had never offered, not in 1992 and not now. Not even as handcuffs clicked shut and a name long buried in dusty reports suddenly dominated every headline in Ohio. Because almost immediately the questions came rushing back, louder than before, sharper, more dangerous, slicing through the brief moment of satisfaction like cold wine through an open door. Detectives went back to the beginning, not ceremonially, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity, because when a cold case breaks open after decades, the first assumption is always the same. Something was missed, and if something was missed once, it could be missed again. They replayed the night frame by frame, street by street, mapping every light source, every shadow, every possible line of sight. The porch light buzzing in the damp air. The quiet hum of the neighborhood settling into sleep. The exact moment when routine cracked and vanished. They asked themselves how a single individual could intercept a woman in those final steps, silence her, remove her from the scene, and leave behind so little chaos it looked staged by the absence itself. The suspect's name triggered a ripple effect. Former neighbors leaned closer to their televisions. Old co-workers stopped mid-sentence. People searched their memories, rewinding conversations from 30 years ago, asking themselves if they had ignored a strange comment, a nervous laugh, a pattern that only made sense now that the answer had been suggested to them. Some claimed they had always suspected him. Others swore they never would have believed it. Memory bent under the weight of the present, reshaping itself to match the headlines. Police interviews resumed with an urgency that felt almost desperate. Witnesses who had once been young now sat under fluorescent lights with gray hair and careful voices, apologizing for gaps they could no longer fill. They spoke about cars parked where they shouldn't have been, footsteps they dismissed as imagination, arguments overheard through open windows. Each statement was logged, cross-referenced, threaded back into the timeline like stitches trying to close a wound that had been open too long. The suspect himself said little. When he did speak, it was controlled, measured, almost practiced. He denied involvement. He questioned the evidence. He asked for a lawyer. Investigators watched his posture, his breathing, the way his eyes tracked the room. Some swore they saw recognition flicker when certain details were mentioned. Others warned against reading too much into decades-old body language. In cold cases, confirmation bias can be as dangerous as ignorance. The DNA match was solid, they said. A technical miracle that 1992 could never have dreamed of. But DNA answers only one question: contact. It does not explain timing. It does not explain motive. It does not explain what happened after the contact ended. And that gap, that dark stretch between scientific certainty and narrative truth, was where the case still bled. Reporters dug into the suspect's past with surgical intensity. Old arrests, old addresses, old relationships. A pattern began to emerge, or at least the suggestion of one, enough to keep the story burning. But there were inconsistencies too, moments where the timeline wobbled, where alibis were thin but not non-existent, where witnesses contradicted each other in ways that felt less like lies and more like erosion. 30 years does that to facts. It smooths edges. It dissolves precision. The victim's family watched it all unfold from a distance that felt unreal. For decades, they had lived in suspended animation, birthdays without candles, holidays with an empty chair, hope rationed carefully so it wouldn't hurt too much when it failed. Now the phone rang again. Detectives spoke in careful tones. Journalists requested interviews. Strangers sent messages offering condolences that arrived 30 years too late and somehow still felt urgent. Closure was promised in cautious language, but promises had burned them before. Behind closed doors, investigators argued. Some believed the arrest was the final piece, the answer waiting patiently all these years for technology to catch up. Others worried the case was being pulled toward resolution by momentum rather than truth, that a town desperate for an ending might accept one too easily. Cold cases are dangerous that way. They invite endings, even when the story resists them. They revisited the physical evidence, what little there was. The purse, the fibers, the partial prints that once meant nothing. New tests were ordered, old assumptions challenged. Why was the cash untouched? Why take the keys but not the wallet? Why here? Why then? Why her? Each question echoed the same realization. If this was a crime of opportunity, it was executed with frightening precision. If it was planned, the planning had left no visible seams. As the legal process moved forward, cracks began to show in the public narrative. Anonymous sources hinted at alternative suspects once dismissed too quickly. A former tip resurfaced, buried under hundreds of others, describing behavior that didn't match the current theory. Online forums exploded with speculation, amateur timelines, accusations, defenses. The case, once forgotten, now lived everywhere at once, fragmented, debated, reassembled nightly by people who had never set foot on that street but felt certain they understood it better than those who had. The town felt the tension physically. Conversations lowered in volume when the case was mentioned. Old friendships strained under differing opinions. Some wanted justice, any justice, now. Others wanted certainty, even if it took longer. The arrest had reopened wounds that had scarred over imperfectly, and the healing process felt more painful than the injury ever had. Late at night, detectives sat alone with the file, the way they always did when the noise died down. They stared at photographs taken under harsh flashbulbs, at handwritten notes from officers long retired or long gone, at margins filled with question marks that suddenly felt alive again. They knew this moment mattered. They knew mistakes now would not fade quietly into obscurity. They would define the case forever. And beneath everything, beneath the headlines and the arguments and the cautious optimism, the original mystery still pulsed. A woman vanished in the space between a car and a front door. No screams, no witnesses, no clear trail. An arrest decades later could not change that fact. It could only attempt to explain it. As the town waited for the next development, for charges, for court dates, for answers that felt real instead of theoretical, a colder thought began to surface, unspoken but persistent, creeping into conversations and sleepless nights alike. What if the arrest was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a far more uncomfortable one? Because some cold cases don't stay buried simply because they want justice. They resurface because the truth refuses to stay quiet. And this one, after 30 years of silence, was just starting to speak. The first court appearance was supposed to draw a line between past and present, a clean division where history could finally be processed and contained, but instead it blurred everything. Because when the suspect stood before the judge, older, heavier, outwardly ordinary. The room filled with a collective unease that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with recognition. The unsettling realization that monsters do not always announce themselves, that sometimes they age quietly among you, attend the same stores, wave from across the street, and carry their secrets so well that even time begins to doubt what it knows. The prosecutor spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it might detonate on contact. DNA evidence, circumstantial links, behavioral indicators. Enough, they said, to move forward. Not enough, they admitted without saying it out loud, to silence every doubt. The defense seized that space instantly, pointing to the decades-long gap, the contamination risks, the witnesses whose memories had thinned with age, the possibility that contact did not equal crime. The word reasonable echoed through the room, heavy and elastic, stretched until it could mean almost anything. Outside, cameras caught reactions in fragments. A neighbor shaking their head, a former classmate wiping tears, a man insisting this was a mistake, a woman insisting it was inevitable. The town watched itself on screen that night, divided and reflected back in high definition. Every expression another piece of evidence in a trial that extended far beyond the courtroom. Behind the scenes, detectives faced a quieter, more dangerous challenge. The arrest had reopened old channels of communication, and with them came information that had once seemed too small to matter. A call logged, but never prioritized. A sighting dismissed as unreliable. A report written in pencil and never followed up. Each rediscovered detail carried the same uncomfortable implication. The case might have been solvable once, if only the right question had been asked at the right moment. They re-interviewed a woman who had lived 2 houses down in 1992, now in her 60s, her voice trembling as she described a sound she'd heard that night. Not a scream, she insisted, but something sharper, metallic, like an object striking concrete. At the time, she had assumed it was a trash can knocked over by the wind. Now she wasn't so sure. Another witness spoke of headlights briefly illuminating the street at an odd angle. A car stopped where it shouldn't have been, engine running but quiet. He had never reported it, convinced it was nothing. Nothing, it turned out, had been expensive. The timeline stretched, then warped. Investigators discovered that the suspect's alibi hinged on a routine that could not be independently verified. No receipts, no surveillance footage, just habits described after the fact, habits that sounded solid until you tried to pin them down. At the same time, other names began to surface again, men once considered but never charged, men whose proximity to the victim now looked more significant than it had through the grainy lens of early 90s policing. Pressure mounted from every direction. The department wanted resolution. The prosecution wanted conviction. The public wanted certainty. And the case itself, stubborn and resistant, seemed to want something else entirely, something messier, something that refused to fit inside a single narrative arc. The victim's family lived in a state of emotional whiplash. Hope surged, then recoiled. They attended hearings, listened to arguments framed in language that felt clinical and distant, as if the person at the center of it all were an abstract concept instead of a daughter, a sister, a laugh remembered more clearly than her voice. At night, they replayed the early days in their minds, the searches, the phone calls, the endless waiting, wondering if justice delayed had changed shape so completely it might not resemble justice at all. As weeks passed, the case began to fracture in the public imagination. Some saw the arrest as a triumph of persistence and technology, proof that time could be outpaced, that no crime truly vanished. Others saw a system scrambling to justify decades of failure by anchoring itself to the strongest evidence available, even if it didn't tell the whole story. Talk radio lit up. Editorials ran side by side, arguing opposite conclusions with equal confidence. Then came the first serious complication. A forensic review revealed that one piece of evidence long considered irrelevant had been mishandled early on, its chain of custody incomplete, its storage conditions questionable. The defense pounced. Motions were filed. Hearings scheduled. Suddenly, the narrative slowed, bogged down in procedure and technicalities that felt, to the public, like obstacles deliberately placed between them and the truth. To investigators, it felt like standing on a fault line, waiting to see which direction the ground would split. Late one evening, a detective received a call that hadn't been expected and couldn't be ignored. A man claiming to have information, not about the suspect, but about the night itself. He spoke hesitantly, as if each word cost him something. He had been nearby, he said. He had seen something wrong. He had stayed silent out of fear, then out of shame, then out of the belief that too much time had passed to matter. Now, with the arrest dominating every channel, the weight had become unbearable. They met him quietly. No cameras, no press, just a small room and a recorder blinking red. His account didn't align perfectly with the official theory. It introduced a vehicle description that didn't match, a second presence where only one had been assumed, a movement pattern that suggested coordination rather than impulse. When he finished, the room stayed silent longer than usual. If he was telling the truth, everything changed. Investigators cross-checked his statements against old records, against weather reports, against the few fragments of physical evidence that remained viable. Some details lined up disturbingly well. Others raised new questions that felt even more dangerous than the ones they replaced. The possibility emerged, quietly at first, that the case had been oversimplified in its rush toward resolution. The prosecutor was informed. Tension spiked. Strategy meetings grew longer, more heated. Do you adjust course and risk weakening the case? Do you press forward and hope the contradictions can be explained away? Every option carried consequences, and none of them guaranteed peace. The town sensed the shift before it was acknowledged publicly. The tone of coverage changed. Certainty gave way to conditional language. Analysts began using phrases like allegedly and pending review with renewed emphasis. The cold case, once declared broken wide open, now looked fractured, its interior more complex and less stable than anyone had anticipated. And beneath it all, the original image returned again and again, stubborn, immutable, a quiet Ohio street, a flickering porch light, a woman walking the last few steps home, unaware that her disappearance would ripple outward for decades, bending lives, shaping institutions, refusing to be neatly explained. As the investigation edged closer to truths it might not be ready to handle, one reality became impossible to ignore. Solving a cold case is not just about identifying a suspect. It is about confronting everything that was missed, everything that was assumed, everything that went wrong when it mattered most. And the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that this case, unresolved for 30 years, was not resisting closure out of spite. It was resisting because the story, in its entirety, had yet to be told. The deeper the investigation pushed, the more the case seemed to push back, as if it had been waiting patiently for this moment, for the confidence of resolution to crack just enough to let the older, darker questions crawl back into the light. Because once the possibility of more than one person entered the narrative, nothing that had once seemed solid remained untouched. Detectives reconstructed the night again, this time with an expanded lens, allowing for angles they had once dismissed as impractical or unnecessary. They studied traffic flow patterns from 1992, noting which roads were under construction, which shortcuts locals favored, which routes could swallow a car and deliver it miles away without attracting attention. They measured how long it would take for two people to act in coordination, one to distract, one to control, one to drive, the other to disappear. The math was uncomfortable. The margins were thinner than anyone wanted to admit, but they existed. Old reports took on new meaning. A tip describing a second voice overheard near the street, once written off as unreliable, now resurfaced with unnerving clarity. A statement from a patrol officer noting tire marks he couldn't classify, recorded and forgotten. Each rediscovered fragment whispered the same thing. The case had never been simple, only simplified. The suspect remained in custody, his public demeanor unchanged, calm to the point of provocation. His defense team adjusted strategy, leaning harder into the uncertainty, framing the investigation as a narrative chasing itself, reshaped by hindsight and public pressure. They questioned the new witness aggressively, dissected inconsistencies, suggested motives for fabrication. Fear, guilt, the desire to matter. In a courtroom, credibility is currency, and decades erode its value quickly. Prosecutors pushed back, arguing that complexity did not equal doubt, that crimes evolve in understanding as tools improve. They reminded the court that cold cases are, by definition, incomplete puzzles, and that filling in missing pieces does not invalidate the picture. But even as they spoke, the weight of the unanswered questions pressed down, heavy and unyielding. The victim's family found themselves caught in the crossfire of theory and procedure. Every development felt personal, every delay an insult disguised as due process. They listened as strangers debated the worth of memories they had lived with for 30 years, as commentators speculated about motives and methods with the detachment of people for whom the case was content, not trauma. Some days, hope felt like a liability. Meanwhile, detectives followed the new thread quietly, aware that publicity could poison it before it had a chance to solidify. They tracked down vehicle registrations matching the witness's description, cross-referenced names long absent from the file. One lead pointed toward a man who had left the state shortly after the disappearance, his departure noted at the time, but never pursued aggressively. Another suggested a connection through work, a shared shift, an overlap that had once seemed coincidental. Each lead carried risk. Pursue it too hard and weaken the primary case. Ignore it and risk burying the truth again. The balance was delicate, and it demanded choices that would not look clean in hindsight. As months passed, procedural delays stacked up. Motions, hearings, continuances. The rhythm of justice slowed to a crawl that felt unbearable to a town conditioned by headlines to expect momentum. Trust wavered. Accusations flew, not just at the suspect, but at the system itself. How many mistakes could be excused by the era? How many by inexperience? How many by the simple fact that no one believed something like this could happen here? A former detective broke his silence in an interview that aired late one night, his voice rough, his words careful. He spoke about pressure in the early days, about limited resources, about leads that went cold because there weren't enough hands to hold them. He stopped short of admitting failure, but the implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. The case, he suggested, had slipped through cracks no one wanted to acknowledge at the time. The interview reignited old anger. Calls poured in, some supportive, some accusatory. The department issued a measured response, emphasizing progress, cooperation, commitment. But behind closed doors, morale dipped. No one wants to be reminded that justice can hinge on luck as much as skill. Late one evening, forensic analysts delivered an update that complicated things further. A re-examination of trace evidence suggested a transfer pattern inconsistent with a single interaction. The conclusion was cautious, wrapped in probabilities and margins of error, but its implication was explosive. More than one contact, more than one moment, more than one opportunity for the truth to fracture. Prosecutors weighed their options. Do you adjust the charges? Expand the scope? Risk overwhelming a jury with complexity? The legal system favors narratives with clean lines and clear villains. This case was offering neither. The suspect's defense capitalized on the uncertainty, filing motions to suppress, to exclude, to delay. Each legal maneuver was a reminder that time, the original enemy of the investigation, was now working in reverse, eroding urgency, blunting outrage. The longer the case stretched on, the easier it became for doubt to settle in. Outside the courtroom, life continued in uneasy parallel. The street where it had all begun looked ordinary again. Children riding bikes past houses that had once been surrounded by tape. But those who had lived there long enough still felt the weight of that night, still glanced at the porch light that no longer flickered, still measured distances unconsciously, counting steps to front doors. The cold case, once frozen by neglect, now simmered under scrutiny, its surface deceptively calm while pressure built beneath. Each new discovery threatened to destabilize the fragile structure of explanation that had formed around the arrest. And with every destabilization came the same haunting question, growing louder with each passing week. What if the truth, when it finally emerged, would not offer the closure everyone had waited for? What if it demanded something more unsettling instead? Because as investigators edged closer to answers that refused to align, one reality hardened into something impossible to ignore. This case was not just about who took a woman from a quiet street in 1992. It was about how easily certainty can be constructed, and how violently it can collapse when the past decides it is no longer willing to stay buried. The deeper the investigation pressed into its own past, the more resistance it encountered, not from suspects or attorneys, but from time itself, from records lost to purges and floods, from memories eroded into impressions rather than facts, because time is not neutral in cold cases. It actively reshapes them, sanding down edges, hiding mistakes, protecting the living at the expense of the truth, and by the 5th month after the arrest, detectives understood they were no longer just solving a crime. They were excavating a history that had been quietly settling for 3 decades. They began to uncover small procedural failures that once seemed harmless. A tip logged without follow-up. A witness categorized as unreliable because she was young, because she was emotional, because she didn't sound certain enough. A patrol officer's report that ended mid-thought, the remainder lost to a filing error. None of these alone explained the disappearance. Together, they formed a pattern that felt uncomfortably human, a reminder that cold cases are often not undone by evil alone, but by exhaustion, assumption, and the pressure to move on. Internal reviews were conducted quietly, deliberately, as if speaking too loudly might collapse what little trust remained. Senior officials insisted this was not about blame. Detectives knew better. Every rediscovered misstep carried an implicit accusation, not just against individuals, but against an era of policing that lacked today's tools and, at times, today's patience. The case became a mirror, reflecting not only what had happened to the victim, but what had happened to the system meant to protect her. The suspect watched these developments with a measured calm that unsettled everyone who encountered it. He rarely reacted in visible ways, even as the narrative shifted around him. When pressed, he maintained his innocence, pointing to the emerging uncertainties as proof that the case was built on inference rather than fact. His attorneys amplified this stance, presenting him as a convenient answer to a question that had grown uncomfortable in its complexity. At the same time, investigators could not ignore the mounting coincidences. His proximity, his movements, the forensic link that refused to disappear no matter how it was challenged. They circled these facts repeatedly, trying to determine whether they formed a constellation or merely a cluster, whether meaning was being discovered or imposed. The town's patience thinned. What had begun as cautious optimism hardened into frustration. People wanted to know why, after all this time, the truth still felt slippery. They wanted to know if the arrest had been premature, if the promise of closure had been used too freely. Public trust, once cautiously restored, began to wobble again, echoing the instability of the case itself. Then came a detail that shifted the emotional center of the investigation. A box, long mislabeled, was found during a routine archival sweep. Inside were personal effects recovered near the time of the disappearance, but never definitively connected to the victim. Items too generic to assign with confidence. Items set aside and forgotten. Now, with fresh eyes and modern testing, they took on new significance. Fibers were reanalyzed. Trace materials compared. One item, in particular, produced results that did not point cleanly toward the suspect, but did not exclude him either. It pointed sideways, toward the possibility of another presence, another hand in the dark. The implications rippled outward. Investigators revisited the theory of coordination with renewed seriousness. If more than one person had been involved, the silence of the street made more sense. Control could have been divided, roles assigned, mistakes minimized. The case began to feel less like an impulsive act and more like an operation, small in scale, but chilling in its efficiency. This raised a question no one wanted to ask aloud. If there were others, where were they now? Had they aged into anonymity? Had they carried this night with them, unburdened by suspicion, protected by the same passage of time that haunted the victim's family? As winter approached, the courtroom calendar filled with hearings that addressed process rather than substance. Motions argued, evidence challenged, deadlines extended. Each delay felt heavier than the last, as if the case were sinking under its own gravity. Outside, the cold matched the mood, gray skies pressing low over a town tired of waiting. Behind closed doors, a strategy emerged that was as risky as it was necessary. Investigators would widen the lens fully, even if it meant weakening the immediate case. They would pursue the alternate vehicle, the peripheral names, the overlooked connections. They would accept the possibility that the arrest, dramatic as it had been, was not the answer but a doorway. This decision fractured the team. Some believed it was the only honest path forward. Others feared it would hand the defense exactly what it needed to dismantle everything. Arguments grew personal. Careers hovered on the edge of consequence. But the choice, once made, could not be undone. The victim's family was informed in a private meeting that stretched late into the evening. There were no promises this time. Only transparency. Only the admission that the truth might be more complicated, more painful than anyone had hoped. They listened in silence, absorbing the familiar ache of uncertainty, and then, quietly, they agreed. Better the truth, they said, than an ending built on doubt. As the investigation widened, a name surfaced that had not been spoken publicly in years. Not a suspect officially, not innocent either. A figure who had moved in the same circles, who had access, who had the means to disappear when scrutiny approached. The file on him was thin, almost intentionally so, as if the case had once flinched away from his shadow. Detectives reopened it. What they found was not a smoking gun, but something more disturbing. A series of near misses, moments where attention drifted just as it should have focused, where questions softened instead of sharpened. The sense grew that this case had not simply gone cold. It had been nudged there. And as that realization settled in, heavy and unwelcome, the cold case began to take on a new shape, one that suggested not just a failure to solve a crime, but a collective reluctance to see it clearly when it mattered most. The silence that followed this discovery was different from the silence of 1992. It was heavier, because it carried with it the possibility that the truth had been close all along, waiting while everyone else looked away. The name they reopened did not arrive with drama. No sudden confession or dramatic arrest, just a quiet return from the margins, a presence that had always been there, but never fully acknowledged, and the longer detectives studied the file, the more unsettling the pattern became. Because this individual had not been overlooked by accident, he had been bypassed, questioned lightly, released quickly, his proximity noted, and then filed away under a category that effectively ended curiosity. In 1992, he had lived close enough to hear the street settle at night, close enough to know routines, close enough to blend into the background without raising alarms. He had offered an alibi that depended on another person's memory, a memory never tested aggressively, never revisited once the case lost momentum. At the time, it had seemed sufficient. Now, it looked fragile. Investigators tracked his movements across the decades. He had changed addresses often. Jobs came and went. Relationships formed and dissolved. Nothing overtly criminal enough to draw attention, nothing clean enough to feel reassuring. The absence of red flags was, in itself, a red flag. People who spoke to him described him as adaptable, agreeable, forgettable in the way that allows someone to pass through lives without leaving impressions strong enough to be recalled with certainty. When they finally reached him, the conversation unfolded cautiously. He expressed surprise at being contacted again, a performance perhaps, or perhaps genuine. He said he barely remembered that night. Who could, after all? 30 years is a long time to hold on to details that no one seemed to care about at the time. But when pressed, small inconsistencies surfaced. Not dramatic contradictions, but subtle shifts. Times rounded. Locations softened. The kind of changes that happen when a story is retold too often to oneself. The interview did not produce a breakthrough, but it left a residue of unease. Detectives compared notes afterward and found themselves circling the same thought without wanting to say it out loud. This man had known more than he admitted, even then. Whether that knowledge made him culpable or merely complicit was a question the evidence could not yet answer. The existence of a second potential actor forced a re-evaluation of the suspect's role. If the crime had involved coordination, then the forensic link could represent contact facilitated by another, a piece of a larger mechanism rather than the mechanism itself. The story widened, and with it, the risk. Prosecutors warned that introducing an alternate theory without definitive proof could fracture the case beyond repair. Yet the investigators could not ignore the echoes. The vehicle descriptions, the movement patterns, the silence of the street. All of it aligned more cleanly when viewed through the lens of more than one participant. What had once seemed like improbable luck now looked like planning. The defense sensed the shift immediately. Their filings grew more confident, their arguments sharper. They painted the investigation as directionless, swayed by pressure and hindsight. In public statements, they questioned why, if others were now considered relevant, their client remained the focus. It was a strategy designed to widen doubt, and it worked. Public opinion fractured again. Some accused law enforcement of incompetence. Others accused them of manipulation. The arrest that once unified the town now divided it along fault lines that mirrored broader anxieties about justice and accountability. Every conversation felt provisional, every conclusion temporary. The victim's family lived in the eye of this storm, absorbing narratives they had no control over. They were asked to comment on theories they did not endorse, to react to developments they had not requested. Privately, they wrestled with a grief that had learned to adapt, now forced to shift shape again. The idea that more than one person might have been involved did not comfort them. It multiplied the harm. As winter deepened, detectives returned to the physical spaces connected to the second name. Former residences, parking areas, routes he would have taken routinely. They searched for overlap with the victim's movements, for points of intersection that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Slowly, a picture emerged, faint but persistent, suggesting that their lives had crossed more often than anyone had realized. A breakthrough came not from technology, but from context. An old employment record revealed that the second individual had worked irregular hours near the victim's route home, hours that placed him in proximity on the night of the disappearance. It was not proof. It was possibility. Enough to justify deeper scrutiny. Enough to disturb the narrative that had held for decades. When confronted with this information, his demeanor shifted. The adaptability faded, replaced by defensiveness. He questioned the relevance. He questioned the accuracy. He questioned the motive behind reopening a chapter everyone else seemed content to forget. The interview ended without resolution, but the tension lingered long after he left the room. Investigators debated next steps late into the night. To pursue this lead aggressively would require resources, time, and a willingness to accept that the original arrest might not deliver the closure everyone demanded. To ignore it would mean repeating the same mistake that had frozen the case in the first place. They chose to pursue it. This decision set off a chain reaction. Subpoenas issued. Old associates contacted. Timelines rebuilt yet again. The case began to feel less like a straight line and more like a web, each strand vibrating when touched, each movement threatening to collapse the structure if handled carelessly. The suspect, still central to the case, watched as the focus widened. His attorneys adjusted their strategy, preparing to argue that the state could not even decide who it believed was responsible. The possibility of reasonable doubt loomed larger than ever. And yet, amid the confusion, something else surfaced. A coherence that had been missing before. When the pieces were arranged to allow for complexity rather than simplicity, the case stopped resisting. It began to make a terrible kind of sense. The cold case was no longer just about who had been arrested. It was about who had been protected by silence. And as the investigation continued to pull that silence apart, thread by thread, the town braced itself for the possibility that the truth, when it finally emerged, would implicate not just individuals, but an entire history of looking away. By the 7th month after the arrest, the case no longer belonged to any single department or courtroom. It had spilled outward into something larger, a reckoning that touched institutions, reputations, and the quiet agreements that allow communities to function without asking too many questions. What had once been framed as a story of patience rewarded now threatened to become a story of avoidance exposed. The renewed scrutiny of the second name triggered a cascade of reactions. Former officials declined interviews. Retired officers hesitated before returning calls. Records requests were met with delays that felt procedural on the surface and strategic underneath. No one said there had been pressure in 1992 to limit the scope of the investigation. No one needed to. The absence of denial spoke loudly enough. Investigators began to understand that the case had intersected with influence, not in the dramatic sense of corruption for profit, but in the subtler form of convenience, the instinct to preserve stability by avoiding disruption. The second individual had connections that made him uncomfortable to pursue aggressively at the time. Not untouchable, just inconvenient. In a town that prized order, inconvenience could be decisive. This realization reframed the past in ways that were difficult to accept. Decisions that had once seemed neutral now appeared shaped by context. Leads that went cold might not have frozen on their own. They might have been left out in the open. The legal teams sensed the shifting ground. Prosecutors weighed the risk of expanding the case into territory that could expose institutional failure. Defense attorneys watched carefully, ready to argue that any hint of bias or selective enforcement undermined the credibility of the entire investigation. The courtroom, once the focal point, became just one arena among many. Public discourse hardened. Community meetings grew tense. Accusations flew, not just about who might have committed the crime, but about who might have enabled it by looking away. Long-standing trust eroded in real time. People questioned not just the past, but the present. If it happened then, could it happen now? The victim's family faced a new, quieter betrayal. The possibility that the case had been constrained by factors beyond evidence felt like a second loss, an insult layered onto grief. They asked questions they had never asked before, about meetings held without them, decisions justified in the name of efficiency, moments when the search had slowed not because it had nowhere to go, but because going further was uncomfortable. Detectives, many of whom had not been involved in the original investigation, felt anger mixed with responsibility. They could not change what had been done, but they could decide what to do now. That choice came with consequences. Whistleblowing, even decades late, rarely arrives without cost. As the case expanded, an unexpected pattern emerged. Other unresolved incidents from the same period began to surface, not identical, not enough to declare a series, but similar in their vagueness, in the way they had stalled and then been quietly archived. Each one alone could be dismissed. Together, they suggested a climate, a set of habits that favored closure over confrontation. This realization chilled the investigators more than any single suspect ever had. They began coordinating with outside agencies, a move that signaled both seriousness and a lack of confidence in internal objectivity. Federal review was discussed, then quietly initiated. Subpoenas gained weight. Old testimonies were revisited under oath. The language shifted from speculative to formal. The second individual was contacted again, this time with less room to deflect. His responses grew sharper, his patience thinner. He accused investigators of harassment, of rewriting history, of punishing him for a crime they could not solve. But when confronted with inconsistencies laid out sequentially, the defensiveness hardened into something closer to fear. Still, nothing definitive emerged. No confession, no direct evidence. Just a tightening circle of implication that refused to close completely. Meanwhile, the original suspect's case moved haltingly forward. Court dates were set, postponed, reset. Each delay fed the narrative of dysfunction. Supporters on both sides grew louder, less patient with nuance. The demand for a clear villain clashed with the reality of a story that refused to simplify itself. Late one night, a former officer agreed to speak, off the record, his voice low, his words careful. He did not claim a cover-up. He described a culture, a time when resources were thin, pressure was constant, and the fastest way to maintain calm was to avoid questions that led to instability. He spoke of leads that felt dangerous to pursue, not because they threatened lives, but because they threatened balance. That balance, he implied, had been valued too highly. When investigators compared his account with what they were seeing in the files, the alignment was uncomfortable. The case had not been sabotaged. It had been softened, edges dulled, urgency diffused. Not enough to make it disappear, but enough to slow it until momentum was lost. The cold case, in this light, became something else entirely. Not a mystery abandoned by chance, but one left unresolved by design. The result of 1,000 small decisions that collectively chose ease over clarity. As this understanding took hold, the town's anxiety deepened. Solving the crime now meant confronting not just an act of violence, but a past that many would prefer to keep buried. The stakes grew heavier. Truth, once a goal, became a threat. And yet, for all the resistance, the momentum did not stop. It shifted, became more deliberate, more cautious, but it continued. Because once a case begins to expose the systems around it, it becomes harder to contain. The night of the disappearance returned again and again in investigators' minds, no longer as a single moment of violence, but as a convergence point where individual choices and institutional habits collided. The silence that followed was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something unresolved, something waiting. And as the investigation pressed forward into territory it had never dared to enter before, one truth became impossible to ignore. This cold case was no longer asking who did it. It was asking why it had been allowed to remain unanswered for so long. The shift from who to why changed everything, because once the question turned inward, the case stopped behaving like a puzzle and started acting like a wound, one that had been covered hastily and left to fester beneath the surface, and with every layer pulled back, the pain intensified. Spreading beyond the night in 1992 into the decades that followed, into offices, meetings, quiet decisions that never made headlines but shaped outcomes all the same. Federal involvement altered the rhythm of the investigation. Conversations became formal. Notes were written with the expectation they might one day be read aloud in courtrooms far from Ohio. The margin for improvisation narrowed. Every claim required corroboration. Every memory demanded documentation. For some, this scrutiny felt like vindication. For others, it felt like an accusation they had never anticipated facing. Old leadership structures were examined not for criminality, but for influence. Who made final calls? Who decided which leads were worth pursuing? Who framed certain suspects as distractions rather than possibilities? Patterns emerged that mirrored the town's social gravity at the time, a subtle hierarchy of credibility that had quietly guided investigative focus. Some voices had carried more weight. Some doubts had been dismissed more easily. This context cast the second individual in a harsher light. His early exclusion from deeper scrutiny no longer looked like coincidence. It looked like alignment. He had fit comfortably within the boundaries of what the town found acceptable, predictable, safe. That comfort had insulated him from suspicion in ways no formal policy would ever admit. When agents interviewed him again, the tone was unmistakably different. He was no longer being asked to help. He was being asked to explain. His answers grew shorter. His patience thinned. He invoked lawyers more quickly. The adaptability that once made him forgettable now worked against him, each shift in demeanor raising new questions about what lay beneath. Still, proof remained elusive. The crime itself, stripped of assumptions, left behind only fragments. And fragments, no matter how suggestive, resist certainty. The investigators understood this better than anyone. They were not chasing a confession anymore. They were chasing coherence. Meanwhile, the original suspect's case hovered in limbo, a symbol of the investigation's divided path. To some, he remained the likely perpetrator, the product of a delayed but righteous system. To others, he had become collateral, a man caught in the gravitational pull of a case desperate for resolution. The truth, whatever it was, sat somewhere between those extremes, unmoved by opinion. The media adapted to the new complexity with difficulty. Soundbites failed. Headlines softened. The story lost some of its initial heat and gained something colder, heavier. Long-form pieces replaced breaking news alerts. Questions replaced declarations. The town consumed these stories slowly, uneasily, recognizing pieces of itself in the descriptions. The victim's family retreated from public view. They had given what they could. Now they waited, carrying a private burden that no investigation could lift entirely. In their quiet moments, they returned to the same image that had haunted them since the beginning. The last ordinary night, the last expected return home, the thin line between routine and rupture. As winter edged toward spring, a discovery surfaced from an unexpected place. A personal journal belonging to someone loosely connected to the second individual, uncovered during a separate inquiry, contained a brief, ambiguous entry dated near the time of the disappearance. It mentioned tension, fear, a night that went wrong. No names, no specifics, just enough to ignite renewed scrutiny. The entry could not stand alone as evidence. It could barely stand at all. But when cross-referenced with known movements and timelines, it aligned too closely to ignore. Investigators treated it carefully, aware of its fragility, but its existence shifted the emotional temperature of the case. The past, long silent, had left a trace in ink. Confronted with this new element, the second individual's responses tightened further. He dismissed it as coincidence. He questioned its authenticity. He suggested motives for fabrication. Each denial added friction. Each explanation raised another question. The circle narrowed, not enough to close, but enough to make escape feel less certain. At the same time, pressure mounted to resolve the original prosecution. Judges demanded progress. Legal timelines loomed. The state faced a decision that could not be postponed indefinitely. Move forward with what they had, or acknowledge publicly that the case was not yet ready to stand. That acknowledgement, when it came, landed heavily. In a carefully worded statement, prosecutors requested additional time, citing newly emerged complexities. The phrase rippled through the town like a shockwave. For some, it confirmed fears of incompetence. For others, it signaled integrity. For everyone, it meant waiting again. The cold case, once declared broken open, now sat exposed, its interior messier and more troubling than anyone had imagined. The arrest that had promised clarity had instead illuminated a labyrinth of human decisions, institutional habits, and moral compromises. And yet, beneath the frustration, something else stirred. For the first time in decades, the case was being treated not as a problem to be closed, but as a truth to be understood. That shift, subtle but profound, changed the stakes entirely. Solving the crime was no longer the only goal. Understanding how it had been allowed to remain unsolved became just as important. As spring rain washed over Ohio, softening the ground and blurring old footprints, the investigation moved forward with a quieter determination. No declarations, no promises, just the steady pressure of questions that refused to fade. The night of the disappearance still held its secrets, but now, finally, it was no longer alone in the dark. Because the silence that followed it had begun to speak. And what it was saying threatened to rewrite everything the town thought it knew. By the time spring fully arrived, the case had reached a point where momentum could no longer be measured by arrests or court dates, but by what people were finally willing to admit. And that shift, more than any forensic result, marked the most dangerous phase of the investigation. Because admissions have a way of pulling other admissions into the light, collapsing long-held narratives with a force no one can fully control. The first crack came quietly. A former municipal employee, retired for years, agreed to speak under the condition of anonymity. He did not offer names. He offered atmosphere. He described the weeks after the disappearance as tense, not because of the crime itself, but because of who might become uncomfortable if the wrong questions were asked. He recalled conversations where certain leads were framed as unlikely before they had been explored, where urgency softened into caution without explanation. At the time, he had accepted it as pragmatism. Now, it felt like complicity. That testimony did not stand alone. Another followed, then another, each one small, each one careful. Together, they formed a chorus of partial recollections that pointed in the same direction. Not to a single directive, not to a villain behind a desk, but to an unspoken consensus that stability mattered more than disruption, that some possibilities were better left untested. Investigators documented these accounts meticulously. They did not editorialize. They did not accuse. They let the pattern speak for itself. And it did, loudly. The second individual, now under sustained scrutiny, felt the pressure intensify. His attorneys attempted to slow the process, to narrow the scope, to argue relevance. But the narrative had already shifted. He was no longer just a peripheral figure. He was a symbol of the path not taken in 1992, of the questions that had been quietly set aside. When confronted with the growing body of contextual evidence, his demeanor fractured, not into confession, but into contradiction. He began to remember more, then less. He offered explanations that overlapped awkwardly with known facts. He accused investigators of retrofitting the past to suit present needs. The more he spoke, the less stable his story became. Meanwhile, the original suspect's situation grew increasingly ambiguous. He remained linked to the case by science, but unmoored by narrative. The prosecution struggled to reconcile these two truths. The defense leaned hard into the contradiction, framing the case as an example of institutional confusion masquerading as justice. The courtroom, when proceedings resumed, felt different, less theatrical, more cautious. Every statement carried the weight of what might follow. Judges asked sharper questions. Motions were scrutinized with new intensity. The margin for error had vanished. Outside, the town watched with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. This was no longer entertainment. It was an autopsy of the past. People recognized neighbors in the descriptions, recognized themselves in the silences. The case had become a mirror no one could turn away from. The victim's family, drawn back into public view against their wishes, spoke only once. Their words were brief, measured, and devastating. They did not ask for vengeance. They asked for honesty, for the truth, even if it was ugly, especially if it was ugly. The simplicity of the request cut through the noise in a way no argument had managed to do. Shortly after, a development landed that no one had anticipated. A previously sealed internal memo surfaced through legal discovery, a document written in the early months of the investigation, referencing the second individual by name and recommending further inquiry. The recommendation had been marked, then deferred, then quietly closed. No explanation. No follow-up. Just a decision, preserved in ink. The memo changed the temperature of everything. It transformed suspicion into something closer to evidence of neglect. It confirmed that the path investigators were now retracing had once been visible, then deliberately abandoned. The question shifted again, from why it had gone cold, to who had decided to let it. The response was immediate. Statements were issued. Explanations offered. The language was cautious, legalistic, designed to diffuse rather than confront. But the damage was done. The case was no longer just unsolved. It was compromised. Federal oversight expanded. Additional subpoenas followed. The second individual's past interactions with local authorities were examined in detail. Patterns of leniency, once dismissed as coincidence, now demanded explanation. None came easily. The original suspect's attorneys filed a motion that cut to the heart of the matter, arguing that their client had been arrested to compensate for past inaction, a substitute for confronting institutional failure. It was a bold claim. It resonated. The prosecution pushed back, but the confidence that had once anchored their position had eroded. They spoke now of parallel truths, of complexity, of the difficulty of justice delayed. The clarity of earlier declarations was gone. As the case teetered between resolution and reckoning, investigators found themselves confronting a truth they could no longer avoid. The disappearance in 1992 had not only stolen a life. It had set in motion a series of choices that shaped the town's identity, its relationship with authority, its tolerance for ambiguity. To solve the case now would require more than evidence. It would require accountability. And accountability, once invoked, does not stop at the point most convenient to those involved. As the 9th chapter of this story closed, the cold case stood at its most precarious moment yet. Not because it lacked answers, but because the answers it was approaching threatened to implicate more than anyone had expected. The silence that had protected those answers for 30 years was breaking apart. And in the fractures, the truth was beginning to show. The moment accountability entered the conversation, the case crossed a threshold it could never retreat from, because accountability demands names, timelines, decisions traced to human hands, and once those hands are identified, the story stops being abstract and starts to bruise, and in Ohio, bruises were beginning to show everywhere. Behind closed doors, federal reviewers began aligning internal memos, interview transcripts, and decision logs like pieces of a negative image, not to prove a conspiracy, but to understand momentum, how it had been generated, where it had slowed, and why. What emerged was not a single dramatic obstruction, but a gradual narrowing of vision, a process by which uncertainty had been treated as inconvenience, and inconvenience quietly managed until the case froze in place. The realization was devastating in its ordinariness. No threats, no envelopes of cash, just a series of choices shaped by pressure, fatigue, and an unspoken desire to keep the town from fracturing under the weight of its own fear. The disappearance had been terrifying enough. Letting it spiral into something larger, something that challenged trust in familiar institutions, had seemed unthinkable at the time. So the edges were softened. The pursuit narrowed. And eventually, the case was allowed to sleep. Now it was awake. The second individual, once protected by that narrowing, felt the ground shift beneath him. Subpoenas reached deeper into his history. Financial records, communications, travel patterns. Nothing explosive surfaced, but the accumulation itself became its own form of pressure. Every omission now looked deliberate, every forgotten detail suspicious. The space he had once occupied comfortably began to constrict. When interviewed again, he spoke with a rehearsed precision that only amplified concern. His words were clean, too clean. Each answer seemed calibrated, as if shaped not by memory but by anticipation. Investigators noted how often he framed his responses around what could not be proven rather than what had happened. It was not incriminating. It was revealing. At the same time, the original suspect's position weakened in an unexpected way, not through exoneration, but through dilution. The more the case expanded, the less central he appeared. The forensic link remained, stubborn and undeniable, but its meaning shifted. Contact no longer equaled culpability in a narrative that now allowed for intermediaries, facilitators, and shields. Prosecutors faced a reckoning of their own. Proceeding to trial risked exposing fractures they could not control. Withdrawing risked public outrage and accusations of incompetence. Every option carried consequences that extended far beyond a single verdict. Meetings stretched into the early hours, voices low, tempers restrained by the gravity of what hung in the balance. When the announcement finally came, it was measured, almost subdued. The state requested a pause. Not a dismissal, not an admission of error. A pause, justified by the need to reassess the scope of the investigation in light of newly surfaced information. The language was careful, but the message was unmistakable. The case, as it stood, was not ready to stand on its own. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some saw the pause as courage, a refusal to force an ending that might later collapse. Others saw it as confirmation of everything they feared, proof that the arrest had been premature, that the promise of justice had been dangled without substance. Trust, already fragile, trembled again. The victim's family absorbed the news privately. No statements, no interviews. They had learned that public reaction did not correlate with truth. In the quiet of their home, they returned to photographs, to letters, to the fragments of a life interrupted. They understood now, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that justice was not a moment but a process, and processes are rarely kind to those forced to endure them. As summer approached, the investigation entered its most delicate phase. Federal findings were shared selectively with state authorities. Names appeared in footnotes rather than headlines. Recommendations were phrased as questions. The goal was not spectacle. It was precision. One recommendation stood out: a formal review of the original investigation's leadership decisions. The suggestion was seismic. It implied that the case's failure might not be attributed solely to limitations of the era, but to choices that could have been made differently, even then. The prospect of revisiting those choices unsettled people who had long believed themselves beyond scrutiny. Retired officials issued statements defending their actions, citing context, resources, and the fog of uncertainty that defines early investigations. They were not wrong. But context, the reviewers noted, does not erase consequence. It explains it. An explanation, while valuable, does not absolve. The town watched these developments with a new kind of attention. Less reactive, more somber. This was no longer about satisfying curiosity. It was about deciding what kind of truth the community could tolerate. One that named a perpetrator and moved on, or one that acknowledged failure and lived with its implications. In the background, the night of the disappearance remained unchanged. No new witnesses emerged. No definitive reconstruction appeared. The street stood quiet, its geometry unaltered by decades of analysis. The absence at its center still resisted resolution. That resistance began to feel intentional, as if the case itself were insisting on honesty before closure. Investigators, seasoned by months of exposure to the past's unfinished business, felt the strain acutely. They knew they were standing at a crossroads where every direction led to loss of some kind. A conviction might bring relief but leave doubts unresolved. An expanded inquiry might honor truth but fracture trust permanently. Late one evening, a federal agent summarized the situation in a sentence that lingered long after the meeting ended. "This case doesn't want to be solved," he said. "It wants to be understood." That understanding, he implied, would require patience measured not in weeks or months, but in willingness. Willingness to accept that the past cannot be fixed, only faced. Willingness to acknowledge that justice delayed changes everyone it touches. As part 10 of this story closed, the cold case stood suspended between exposure and resolution. The arrest that once shocked the town now felt like an opening move rather than an ending. The institutions that had promised answers now found themselves questioned. And the community, once united by fear, then divided by certainty, now hovered in a state of uneasy clarity. They knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next would not be simple. Because the truth, when it finally arrived, would not just explain what happened in Ohio in 1992. It would explain everything that had happened since. By the time autumn returned, the town no longer measured time in seasons, but in revelations, each one arriving without warning, each one stripping away another layer of comfort, until the case was no longer something people followed, but something they carried. An unspoken weight that followed them through grocery aisles, school parking lots, quiet streets where porch lights flickered on at dusk just as they always had, unchanged by everything that had been unearthed beneath them. The pause announced by the state did not bring silence. It brought scrutiny. Investigators continued their work without press conferences or bold declarations, moving deliberately, almost cautiously, aware now that every step forward also stepped backward into the past. Files once considered closed were reopened. Decisions once justified by circumstance were re-examined line by line. The cold case was no longer frozen. It was fragile. The original suspect remained in a liminal state, neither convicted nor cleared, existing in the narrow space where suspicion lingers without resolution. His name still surfaced in conversations, but with a different tone. Less certainty, more hesitation. People spoke of him the way they spoke of the case itself, carefully, as if careless words might break something that could never be repaired. The second individual, once shielded by omission, now lived under the slow burn of attention. Not the dramatic glare of accusation, but the steady heat of inquiry. Friends distanced themselves. Familiar routines changed. He was no longer invisible. Yet still, nothing definitive emerged. No confession, no physical evidence tying him conclusively to the night in question. Only proximity, opportunity, and the unsettling knowledge that he had once been closer to the truth than anyone had been allowed to know. Federal reviewers issued their final assessment quietly. It was thorough, it was restrained, and it was devastating in its implications. They did not accuse. They described. They outlined how investigative focus had narrowed prematurely, how alternative theories had been deprioritized, how the absence of certainty had been mistaken for the absence of threat. The report concluded not with blame, but with a sentence that resonated far beyond the case itself. Unresolved harm compounds when accountability is deferred. That sentence echoed. It echoed in town meetings where residents debated what justice even meant anymore. It echoed in local newsrooms where editors struggled to frame a story without an ending. It echoed in the victim's family, who had learned that closure was a word other people used when they needed comfort. They declined interviews again. Their silence had become its own form of testimony. As winter approached, momentum slowed, not because the investigation had stalled, but because it had reached a point where answers could no longer be forced. The remaining questions resisted pressure. They required something rarer than evidence. They required truth offered freely. And truth, after decades of avoidance, does not rush. The street where the disappearance occurred was visited one final time by investigators. No tape, no lights, just a slow walk, boots crunching softly against gravel, eyes tracing lines they had traced before. They stood where the last confirmed sighting had been recorded. They noted how ordinary it all looked, how it always had. That ordinariness, they understood now, was part of what had allowed the case to fade. Nothing about the night had screamed danger. Nothing about the victim had suggested vulnerability. The absence had arrived quietly, and quiet things are easier to ignore. One investigator lingered longer than the others. He stared down the road, imagining the seconds that had never been documented, the choices made in a space no record could reach. He knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that the truth existed. Not as a single revelation, but as a sequence of moments, each one still intact somewhere, untouched by time. Whether those moments would ever be spoken aloud was another question entirely. The town prepared for the holidays with an unfamiliar restraint. Decorations appeared, but subdued. Celebrations went on, but softer. The case had taught them something they could not unlearn. That safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. That evil does not always announce itself. That the past is not past simply because it is old. The arrest that had once shocked the town now felt distant, almost unreal, like a headline from another life. It had promised clarity. Instead, it had exposed complexity. It had not closed the cold case. It had cracked it open, revealing not just what might have happened in 1992, but how easily certainty can be constructed when doubt is inconvenient. As the year ended, officials acknowledged publicly what many had already accepted privately. The case remained unsolved. The words landed without drama. No outrage followed. No collective gasp. Just a slow exhale from a community that had been holding its breath for 30 years. The absence of resolution no longer felt like failure. It felt like honesty. The victim's name was spoken one last time at a vigil held without cameras. Candles burned. Stories were shared quietly, not about the crime, but about the life that had preceded it. Laughter surfaced, briefly, unexpectedly. It reminded everyone why the search for truth had mattered in the first place. When the candles burned out, people went home. The files remained open. Somewhere, someone still knew what happened. Investigators believed that. The town believed it too. The cold case, despite everything, had not gone silent. It waited, patient, persistent, unwilling to be forgotten. And perhaps that was its final act. Not to deliver an answer neatly wrapped in justice, but to remain a presence that demanded remembrance, that refused the comfort of false endings, that lingered as a reminder that mystery, once created, does not disappear just because time has passed. As the last light faded from the street where it all began, the truth remained just out of reach, close enough to feel, distant enough to haunt. The Ohio 1992 cold case was still open, and the silence around it was louder than ever.